All right, so South Korea, headlines,
Yeah.
right? Big implications. International relations, political upheaval,
Hmm.
martial law.
Yeah.
And this is a big deal for UPSC aspirants, right? Because understanding, these global events and comparing different political systems, I mean, it's crucial, right, for
Mm.
mains and even parts of it for prelims.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, South Korea, what's going on there, right? It really provides a good example, I think, for UPSC aspirants to think about some of the challenges to democracy, especially, this idea of democratic backsliding,
Right.
where, you have a country that has built up a democratic system, but then they face instability, threats to their values. It's something that we see all around the world.
Okay. So to get to where South Korea is today, right,
Yeah.
we got to go back, right? Look at their journey to democracy, and it's been marked by authoritarianism, military rule, and then finally, that transition to a democratic system. But it was hard won.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a long road, right? And I think starting, with the early 20th century, we got to look back at the Japanese colonial rule,
Right.
right? I mean, that had a huge impact on their political development. And then, of course, after World War II, you have the division, right? The Korean Peninsula divided at the 38th parallel.
Right, North and South, and I mean, basically, this is what turns Korea into like a Cold War battleground, right? You got the South under U.S. influence, the North under Soviet control.
Right, exactly. So, and even in the South in the early years after independence, right? It's not like everything was smooth sailing. You had Syngman Rhee, and, he's elected democratically, right? But his regime, it becomes, more and more repressive.
Yeah, this is that. I mean, it's fascinating, right? This pattern that we see,
Yeah.
all throughout history, democratic backsliding. But what's interesting is that the South Korean people, I mean, they didn't just like sit back and take it. They resisted.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You look at 1960, right? The student-led uprisings. I mean, that's a powerful example. People demanding democratic reforms.
Hmm.
Those protests, they ultimately led to Rhee's resignation. It shows you, right, the power of people, of collective action.
It really does. I mean, it makes you think about, citizen movements today, right? And how important they are
Yeah.
safeguarding these, these democratic values. But even after Rhee's gone, right? I mean, South Korea's path to democracy is still not, it's not paved. It's not smooth.
No.
And then they go into this period of military rule.
Right. And to understand this current crisis, I think we really need to look into this concept of martial law, right? Because it's been declared multiple times throughout South Korea's history. And this latest declaration by President Yoon, I mean, it really raised a lot of concerns, right?
Yeah.
Domestically, internationally.
Yeah, it's alarming. I mean, the circumstances, surrounding the declaration, it was murky, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people saw it as a potential power grab.
Mm.
Trying to silence dissent, consolidate control. But we really got to understand how martial law works,
Mm.
Like within a country's legal framework.
Right, right. So in South Korea, their constitution, Article 77, it kind of lays out the conditions for declaring martial law, right? Typically, wartime, armed conflict, national emergencies.
Uh-huh.
But, there's always that potential for abuse, right? Especially when you have a situation where the person who's benefiting from declaring martial law is the same person who's determining, what's an emergency.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it really raises the question, about balance of power. What are the safeguards? What can we do to prevent, these erosion of democratic principles? But, the fact that South Korea's legislature, they impeached President Yoon. I mean, that shows you, right? Checks and
Yeah.
balances can function, even in tough situations.
Yeah, for sure. It highlights that having those checks and balances is crucial, right? In any democratic system. Now, if we shift our focus a bit to India, it's interesting to compare how martial law is approached, right,
Yeah.
within our own constitutional framework.
Right. And this is where things, I think, get really interesting for us, right? As Indians,
Yeah.
as UPSC aspirants, how does India, a country with a very different history, political system, how do we deal with this concept of martial law?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, unlike South Korea, India's constitution, it doesn't have a specific provision for declaring martial law, right? It's
Yeah.
not explicitly stated. It's kind of implied, though, right, through Article
Okay.
34,
Okay.
which talks about restricting fundamental rights, when martial law is in effect. But,
Yeah.
it doesn't specifically say who can declare it or what are the triggers.
Right. So it's a little more nuanced, right? A little more maybe even a little more ambiguous
Right.
than South Korea's, explicit constitutional provisions.
Yeah.
And this is, as UPSC aspirants know,
Yeah.
right? These nuances in India's legal framework. I mean, this is essential, right, to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this comparison, right, between the two systems, it raises a lot of questions, right? About safeguards,
Yeah.
about how do you prevent the misuse of these powers,
Mhm.
right? These extraordinary powers. It's a reminder that, even these abstract legal concepts, they have real world implications, right?
Absolutely.
And it's worth really, digging into.
Before we get too far into the weeds on martial law in India, I want to talk about this connection between India and South Korea,
Yeah.
because it's fascinating, it's unexpected, and it kind of reminds you that international relations, they're often shaped by these historical ties. They go way beyond just what we see today.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting because it challenges that idea that, geography is everything in international relations, right?
Uh-huh.
So there's this story, right, about Princess Saratna, and she is believed to have traveled from India to Korea and married King Kimsuro. I mean, that's a pretty ancient tie,
Okay.
right?
It's remarkable. I mean, these connections, these historical connections, often they get overlooked in mainstream narratives, right?
Yeah.
But they resurface, and they really give you, I think, a deeper understanding of the relationship. And this is the kind of insight, I think, that really sets UPSC aspirants apart,
Yeah.
showing that you have a well-rounded, understanding of international affairs.
Yeah, and it's not just ancient legends, right? You look at Rabindranath Tagore's poem "Lamp of the East." I mean, it's still revered in Korea today, and that shows you, right, the cultural exchange. I mean, these historical and cultural links, they provide a unique lens, to look at what's happening between India and South Korea today.
It's fascinating. I mean, all these different threads, right? Martial law, democratic backsliding, ancient legends. It's all interwoven.
Yeah.
And for UPSC aspirants, I mean, to unravel these threads, it's crucial, right?
Yeah.
To understanding global affairs.
Yeah, for sure. And as we keep going, right, in this deep dive, we'll explore more of those connections. We'll compare the political systems, and we'll look at the key takeaways for India, right? At India's role on the world stage.
All right. Stay tuned. We're going to unpack martial law in India. We'll go deeper into those historical ties, and we'll look at the partnership that's booming right now between India and South Korea. And remember, this is not just for UPSC.
Right.
This is about understanding the world around us. So let's unpack this martial law in India. And we've said it's not explicitly defined in our constitution, right? So it makes it well, a little more complex, I think, than in South Korea.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, South Korea, they've got it, pretty clearly laid out in their constitution, right, what it takes to declare martial law. But in India, it's more, it's more nuanced. Article 34, like we talked about, right, it mentions restricting fundamental rights, when martial law is in effect. But it doesn't spell it out, right? Like, what are the triggers? Who has the authority? It's not, black and white.
Right, and that lack of clarity, I mean, it seems like it could lead to some ambiguity, right? Maybe even misuse. I mean, especially when we think about India and our commitment to democratic principles.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. I mean, not having a clear-cut framework, it could raise some red flags, right? About the potential for, someone to use this power arbitrarily.
But it's interesting, right? Because even though we have this provision, India's never actually formally declared martial law since independence.
Right. So it's this power that's there, but it's been dormant in India's post-independence history.
Right.
But I mean, it doesn't mean that it's irrelevant, right? I mean, especially for us preparing for UPSC, understanding these nuances, even if they haven't been used. I mean, that's crucial, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess you could say the closest India came was during the emergency, right? Back in the 70s. But even then, it wasn't formally imposed. So, I mean, it seems like there's a certain hesitation, right, to use this power, even though it's there. It's potentially it can be misused.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm curious. What do you think? What kind of factors make it more or less likely, right, in India that martial law would be declared? I mean,
Right.
could it be like widespread civil unrest or a major security threat? Could those be, potential triggers?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say for sure,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, those scenarios, I mean, they could definitely be considered potential triggers, I think. But you look back, right, at history, and it does seem like the Indian government, they've been hesitant to invoke martial law even during pretty tough times.
Right.
So maybe it's the legacy of the emergency, right? The sensitivity around restricting fundamental rights. I think those probably play a role in that cautious approach.
Right. So let's say hypothetically, right? Martial law is declared in India. What does that even look like? I mean, what kind of powers would the military have? How would it impact, ordinary citizens?
Well, you look at historical examples, right? Legal interpretations. It seems like the military they would probably take on a lot of authority, to maintain order. And we could be talking about things like curfews, restrictions on movement, assembly. I mean, potentially even setting up military courts.
Right. But wouldn't those measures kind of clash with, those fundamental rights
Yeah.
that are guaranteed by the Indian Constitution? I mean, freedom of speech, right to assemble peacefully. Those are like the cornerstones of our democracy.
Yeah, and that's why Article 34 is so important, right? Because it acknowledges that, you can restrict fundamental rights during martial law, but it also gives Parliament the power to grant indemnity, for
Mm.
actions that are taken under those circumstances. So it's trying to find that balance, right, between security and protecting individual liberties.
Right. So, I mean, while martial law could lead to, some rights being restricted, there are mechanisms in place, right, to make sure that there's accountability and that there's not just this unchecked uh, abuse of power.
Yeah, that's the idea. That the indemnity clause, it's like a legal shield, right, for people who are acting under martial law. It protects them from being prosecuted, later on, as long as their actions were, seen as necessary to restore order. It's a complicated legal concept, though, right? With pretty big implications for the balance of power in situations like that.
Right. So what about the Supreme Court? I mean, what role do they play in all this? Wouldn't they, step in if things start, getting out of control? Wouldn't they try to safeguard, those fundamental rights?
Yeah, the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, they have a really critical role, right? I mean, in upholding the Constitution, even during these extraordinary times.
Hmm.
And the courts actually said before, that declaring martial law doesn't mean that habeas corpus is automatically suspended,
Right.
right? So even under martial law, you can't just be detained, arbitrarily. There has to be due process.
Right. So that's a crucial safeguard, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it means that even if martial law is imposed, citizens, they still have the right to challenge their detention and demand a justification. I mean, it really underscores that principle that even in times of crisis, rule of law,
Mhm.
it has to prevail.
Exactly. Yeah, the Supreme Court's their stance it emphasizes that point, right? That even during emergencies, the Constitution is still it's still the highest law of the land, and
Mhm.
and those fundamental rights. I mean, they might be restricted, but they're not completely gone.
Right. This whole discussion about martial law, I mean, in South Korea, in India, it really highlights that tension, right? Security versus liberty. I mean, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for democracies, all around the world,
For sure.
and for UPSC aspirants. I mean, understanding those nuances, it's essential, right? For analyzing political systems, legal frameworks.
Mhm.
How does India uphold those democratic principles when things get tough?
Yeah. And it's a sensitive topic, right? Martial law. I mean,
Yeah.
potentially controversial, but I think it's important to really engage with it, critically. Look at the historical context. Look at what it could mean for the future of democratic governance.
Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to this connection, between India and South Korea. We talked about the ancient legends, but there's another really fascinating historical link, and that's India's role in the Korean War. And this is a period that often gets overlooked, right? But it was a big deal in shaping the geopolitical landscape of the region, and in a lot of ways, it laid the foundation for what we see today between India and South Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, India's involvement in the Korean War, I think it really speaks to our commitment, right,
Hmm.
to international peace and diplomacy, and often, we look at that period through the lens of the Cold War, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
But India, even though we were not aligned, we played a big role in shaping how that conflict
Well,
played out.
it is interesting, right? I mean, India's a newly independent nation at that time, and we choose to get involved, in a conflict so far away. What was the motivation for that?
Well, I think a few things, right? I mean, one was that commitment to the principles of the United Nations, right? And believing that multilateralism, that's how we resolve these international disputes. So India saw that conflict as a threat, right? To global peace, and felt like we had a responsibility to do something, to help resolve it.
So it was a principled stance,
Yeah.
rooted in India's foreign policy vision, but there were also some practical considerations as well, right? I mean, the Korean War, it had the potential to really destabilize
Yeah.
the whole region, and that has implications for India's security.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, India, we recognize that, right? That
Yeah.
that conflict, it could escalate, it could draw in other powers, and that would create, this much wider instability, and preventing that, that was in India's strategic interest.
Okay, so a combination, right? Principled, commitment to peace, and then these strategic considerations. But I mean, what exactly was India's role? I mean, what did we do in the Korean War?
Well, I mean, it was multifaceted, right? It started with chairing the UN Commission, right? That was tasked with overseeing those elections on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, that was a big deal. And KPS Menon, the Indian diplomat, he played a key role, right, in navigating that whole complex political landscape.
So even before the fighting broke out, India was involved, right?
Yeah.
Trying to find some kind of peaceful resolution to the Korean crisis.
Exactly. And then when the war actually, started
Yeah.
in 1950, India, we didn't get involved in the actual fighting, right? But we
Uh-huh.
we played an active role in providing humanitarian aid.
Wow.
So the 60th Parachute Field Ambulance, which was a medical unit that India sent, they provided, much needed medical assistance
Hmm.
to everyone who was affected by the war. Didn't matter which side they were on.
It's a remarkable example, right? India's commitment to those humanitarian principles, even in the middle of this politically charged conflict. It shows the power of soft power and the importance of diplomacy, right, in
Right.
international relations.
Yeah, absolutely. And India focusing on providing medical aid, it was seen as neutral. It was seen as a humanitarian gesture, and I think that helped to build trust, with both sides,
Right.
and it aligned with India's non-aligned stance, our commitment to peaceful resolution.
And it wasn't just the medical aid, right? I mean, India was actively involved in trying to mediate between the warring factions, right? I remember reading about India's role in the ceasefire negotiations.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, India was crucial in getting that dialogue going,
Oh,
right,
yes.
and pushing for a peaceful resolution. In fact, a UN resolution that India sponsored, it led to that ceasefire declaration in 1953, right? So it effectively ended the active fighting in the Korean War.
Wow. So India was instrumental in bringing an end to the bloodshed
Yeah.
and paving the way, right, for a negotiated
Yeah.
settlement. I mean, that's a big deal, especially when you consider all those Cold War dynamics that were at play.
Yeah, it really shows India's, diplomatic skills and our ability to engage with all the different stakeholders in a conflict, right? And I think it also highlights that India, we recognized early on how important, dialogue and negotiation are, in resolving these international disputes.
And even after the ceasefire, India's involvement, I mean, it didn't stop, right? We were also involved in resolving that whole issue of prisoners of war.
Yeah, that's another key part of India's role. We sent a brigade group. They were known as the Custodian Forces India, the CFI,
Yeah,
and they played a big role in getting those prisoners of war, repatriated and making sure that they were treated humanely.
it's amazing. India took on that task, right?
Right.
Which was complex and sensitive, and it just shows, again, that commitment to upholding those international humanitarian norms.
Absolutely. Yeah, India's role in the Korean War, I think, it shows this multifaceted approach, right, to
Yeah.
how we engage internationally, from chairing those UN commissions to mediating those ceasefire agreements to the humanitarian aid and overseeing that repatriation of prisoners. It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
It's an example of how India, from the beginning was contributing to global peace and diplomacy, and it really laid the groundwork for that strong relationship that we see today between India and South Korea.
It's amazing how, an event that happened, so long ago, it can still teach us so much,
Mm.
right, about international relations. And this is the kind of analysis that UPSC aspirants they need, right?
Mm-hmm.
Connecting those dots
Yeah.
between historical events and what's going on today. It's crucial for developing that nuanced perspective on global
Yeah.
affairs.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And as we, move into the last part of this deep dive, I think we'll explore how that historical foundation, right? It's led to the strong partnership that we see today
Yeah.
between India and South Korea. It's a partnership that spans, economics, defense, and culture. It really reflects how multifaceted their ties are.
Stay tuned. We'll dig deeper into how this partnership's evolved, and we'll analyze what it means for both countries in the 21st century, and for our UPSC aspirants.
Yeah.
Pay attention to those key takeaways, right? Because this kind of analysis, I mean, it could be really valuable for both mains and prelims.
Yeah, for sure. And don't forget the Indian Express, they continue to be a great source for in-depth analysis and reporting on all this stuff.
Absolutely.
So definitely encourage you to check out their website and stay up to date.
All right, so we've talked about ancient legends, historical ties, but let's look at today, India and South Korea.
Yep.
It's a real partnership, right? I mean, it goes beyond just those stories.
Absolutely. It's a 21st century partnership, right?
Yeah.
Robust, multifaceted. I mean, economics, defense, culture, it's that kind of comprehensive relationship that's really becoming essential in today's world.
Yeah, yeah. So for those of us, who follow international relations, especially UPSC aspirants, what are the key highlights? What makes this partnership stand out?
Well, I mean, the economic ties are really thriving. They've got this special strategic partnership, right? And that just shows you how important it is to both countries. And then you've got the CPTE, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, signed back in 2010. And that's really, boosted that bilateral trade and investment.
And I think I read somewhere that trade, the bilateral trade between the two countries, it actually hit like record levels in 2023, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you happen to have those figures?
Yeah. Yeah, it was over 24.4 billion US dollars. So I mean it's a pretty substantial amount. And it just shows you how interconnected their economies are,
Hmm.
becoming. And you've got these big Korean companies, right? Like Hyundai, Samsung, LG. They've invested a lot in India, especially in things like automobiles, electronics, infrastructure.
So it's not just trading goods back and forth. It's actual investment on the ground, creating
Yep.
jobs,
Yeah.
contributing to India's growth. It seems like a win-win, right, for both countries.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, India gets that investment, right? Technology transfer. Korea gets access to a huge, and growing market. So it's a good example of how that economic cooperation can really, benefit everyone involved.
And it's not just the economics, right? I mean, there's a defense partnership that's also growing, and given the situation, right, the geopolitical landscape, especially in the Indo-Pacific, I mean, this is pretty significant. Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, they both recognize those shared security challenges, right? And they've really been stepping up that defense collaboration in recent years. I mean, they signed a roadmap in 2019 for defense industrial cooperation, and that focuses on joint development, right?
Yeah.
Joint production of military equipment. And I think I saw something about India actually participating in a big defense exhibition in Seoul, showing off some of our capabilities, and that seems like a real concrete demonstration of this growing partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. And those developments, I think they show how India and South Korea's strategic interests are kind of coming together, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to the maritime domain. And they're also looking at joint exercises, training programs, ways to make their armed forces work better together.
So it's a multi-dimensional partnership, right? Economics,
Yeah.
defense,
Yeah.
but let's not forget about culture, right? Which can be subtle, but it's still a big part of building those closer ties.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the cultural exchange it's really active. The Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center in Korea, they're always promoting Indian art, music, dance, and then you have the Sarang Festival, right, every year.
Yeah.
That's organized by the Indian Embassy, and that showcases all that diversity of India's heritage, right, to Korean audiences.
It's great to see how those initiatives, right? They can bridge those gaps, geography, language, and it helps, right? Build that understanding and appreciation between people. And I think our listeners, especially those preparing for UPSC, they can really appreciate how those soft power initiatives, they're really an important part of how India operates in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Cultural diplomacy, it's all about making those connections, right?
Yeah.
People to people. And that just strengthens the foundation for everything else.
Yeah, so we've gone from, ancient legends and historical ties to this, this booming, modern day partnership, and it just shows, right, that countries with shared values, shared interests, they can build something strong, something that lasts.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And for UPSC aspirants, I think this deep dive is a good example, right, of how international relations work, understanding those bilateral relationships, looking at the history, figuring out those key areas of cooperation. I mean, that's essential if you want to really understand, how the world works.
Absolutely. And we couldn't have done this, without the great reporting and analysis from the Indian Express. So we encourage you to check out their website, subscribe to their coverage. They do a great job covering all these international issues.
Yeah, the Indian Express is a great resource if you wanna stay informed.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. We've explored South Korea's political upheaval, this concept of martial law, and that fascinating relationship between India and South Korea. We hope you found it helpful, insightful, and don't forget to like, subscribe, share this with your fellow UPSC aspirants, and we'll see you next time as we keep exploring the world and how it all works.